Welcome everyone to our hybrid genealogy first Monday of the month program here at Spartanburg County Public Libraries. I am Charity Rouse, the Director of Local History, and I'm happy to have 5 people in the room with me now. Glad some additional folks came in, as well as a whole bunch of you online, and I can't see that number, so we're glad you're here. This lecture is being recorded for our genealogy playlist on the library's YouTube channel. And so if you go to spartanburglibraries.org, click the little YouTube symbol at the bottom right of your screen, it will take you to the YouTube channel, choose genealogy playlist, and this will be in that playlist, along with many lectures given over the last 2 years since we started recording. And it'll take a couple of days to get that up, but we'll try to send out an email to those who've given us an email, letting them know when it's posted and where it's posted. So tonight we are talking about searching for free people of color before emancipation. And as I select these topics months in advance. And as I got into it, I realized we needed to talk a little bit about pre-emancipation history and what emancipation means. So we're going to look a little bit at the timeline. So for enslavement and emancipation in America, a couple things we need to remember. The transatlantic slave trade was active between 1514 and 1866, not just in what became the United States, but across the Americas and in the triangle trade. By the 1550s, enslaved Africans were in the Caribbean and Spanish colonies, mostly south of the current United States. And then in 1619, the first Africans arrived in the Virginia colony and were sold into servitude for 7 to 25 years, just like their European counterparts. So it was not enslaved as we came to practice slavery. It was an indenture. And many of those indentured, really, Africans from Angola did eventually become free and then import their own Africans. And one of those Angolans was actually the first person to lifetime indenture one of the Africans. So it gets more and more complicated the more we learn about the history. There's a great book called The Arrival of the First Africans, and it is by Rick Murphy, and it talks about the story of those original 20 Angolans who were actually stolen by British privateers from a Portuguese slave ship. And it gets very complicated, and it's a really good book, and I think we've got a copy in the circulating collection. This is the Kennedy Room's copy. But it's a very fascinating story, to be sure. Now, in the 1600s, by the mid-1600s, those life indentures were turning into what we know of as slavery. And while there were still some lifetime indentures for people, Europeans who had committed serious crimes, murder, etc., it would be this lifetime indenture, the slavery idea by the mid-1600s was being put forward for those of darker skin tones. By the end of the 1600s, slavery was legal in all English colonies. Remember, I said originally the Caribbean colonies were mostly in the Spanish colonies, the British colonies, the Dutch and French colonies as well. Slavery became very prevalent in the Caribbean and then transferred into Central America, South America, and North America. So I got this point slightly out of order, but it transitions into the next topic. By 1750, so roughly 100 years later, 14% of the population of New York colony were enslaved persons. So we tend to think of slavery as a Southern thing, and it was not, or at least not only. So Northern states did begin to emancipate enslaved persons earlier than Southern states. And the thing to know is that it was not an immediate emancipation. And often these emancipation laws that were passed beginning in Vermont in 1777, which actually emancipated its first people in 1791, there were delays of up to 28 years apprenticeships for those born after whatever the date was in their Emancipation Act. But that Emancipation Act overall did not apply to anyone born prior to that date. So if you were an adult enslaved person in the North, you were going to be enslaved for life unless you could buy your freedom, which did begin happening more and more often, but it took a while. Massachusetts passed their Emancipation Act in 1781. So this is after the Revolution. New York passed it in 1778, but slavery still lasted for another 25 years there. Pennsylvania had one of the more interesting emancipation rules and laws. They passed an act in 1778 that was enacted in 1780, but the first actual emancipations did not happen until 1808. But children born in 1780 were apprenticed for 28 years, but no one born before 1780 was emancipated. So, gradual emancipations in these northern states. And just random factoid, New Jersey still had 18 enslaved persons on the 1860 census at the eve of the Civil War. Now, the grand total of numbers enslaved in the North was lower than in the South and in the southern states. And it was because of what the agricultural needs were and those types of things. So in the North, it was more likely that someone was enslaved and they were household servant, dealing with that as opposed to field hands in the agricultural South, especially as we expanded into the Trans-Mississippi South, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, into Texas. At the time of the Missouri Compromise in 1820, the US population was 9,638,453. The African American population was 1,764,833. The enslaved population was 1,531,436. So right just over 200,000 or just under 200,000 free people of color were in the country as of 1820. Remember what I said, in the 1600s, those original indentured enslaved, the original Africans who came to what became the US, were able to get their freedom after they worked their contracts, and they reproduced. And so there were free people of color. Over time, northern states and southern states, enslaved persons were able to, in some cases, purchase their freedom. As of 1820, there were 20 states and territories where slavery was still happening, 9 states and territories without slavery. But all states restricted the rights of African Americans. So voting rights, property rights, the right to be out after dark, different laws, what we would know later on as Black laws or as Jim Crow laws. Those laws were not particularly new post-Civil War, but they got worse and more prevalent post-Civil War. But all states did restrict the rights of African Americans throughout a lot of the history. The Compromise of 1850, the US population had grown to 23,200,000 roughly. The African American population was 3,600,000. The enslaved population was 3,200,000. So about 400,000 free people of color by 1850. So the number has grown, the percentage not so much, just because the population had grown significantly. But states and territories with slavery in 1850 were 17. States and territories without slavery were 19. And there were a couple out there hanging in. California had just come in 1850 as a free state. Utah and Nevada were out there with, okay, we'll let you all decide whether you're free state or slave state. The Kansas-Nebraska Act hadn't happened yet, which was, again, compromising on balancing free states and slave states. Again, all states were still restricting the rights of African Americans, but the Compromise of 1850 is where we get the Fugitive Slave Act, which meant if you escaped slavery and went to one of the free states, they were legally required to return you. Did it always happen? No, often it didn't, but that was the law at that time. So, once we get to the Civil War, at the time we think of emancipation happening. In 1863, the Emancipation Proclamation declared freedom for the enslaved in the rebellious states, but not those states under Union control. There were states that stayed in the Union where slavery was still legal. 1865, the 13th Amendment, which was passed in January, was ratified by enough states in December, and that freed the last enslaved in New Jersey, those 18 poor souls who were under lifetime indenture, and then other Union areas, other areas under Union control, like Kentucky and a few other states, Maryland, Kentucky, DC, etc. And then Delaware, bless them, they finally ratified the 13th Amendment in 1901. So technically, they did not abolish slavery until 1901. Now, functionally, it was gone well before then. But sometimes you have to look at the language of the law and go, huh. Then again, the women's right to vote, that amendment, one of the states just finally, I think Virginia just passed it a couple of years ago for the 100th anniversary of the amendment. So sometimes you get it right, and sometimes it takes a while to get it right. And it did take time. We celebrate Juneteenth as a celebration. That was in 1865, when Texas enslaved finally got the word that the Emancipation Proclamation had taken effect for Texas, January of 1863. We had a large celebration here in Spartanburg, and behind the screen in the room, we have a flag that was made for that celebration in September of 1865. So it did take time for the news to filter through and for people to start figuring out what was going on. And then the Black laws and the Jim Crow laws started being enacted to, wasn't officially slavery, but man, it looked kind of similar in many places. So, a couple of other dates to know. In 1807, the importation of enslaved Africans via the transatlantic triangle trade was outlawed. And this did cause a boom in the domestic slave trade between the states. So domestically produced children of women who were slaves, it became law that you had the status your mother had. So it was not by your dad, it was by your mom. If your mom was a slave, then you were a slave. And so it didn't matter who your daddy was, but if your mama was a slave, you were a slave. Some of the free people of color that we find in the records are the children of slave owners by their enslaved women. And so sometimes you will see those daddies or uncles or brothers or whoever ends up inheriting, doing the right thing, freeing and educating those children. Sometimes you don't, but we can't do a lot about what people were doing 100 years ago, 200 years ago. We can work through it today and work to rectify things. By the start of the American Civil War, 1861, approximately 2% of the total population and 9% of African Americans in the US were free people of color. So again, this gives us people to look for in the records we're going to talk about. By 1860, 95% of African Americans lived in the South. The boom in agriculture, the change to cotton manufacture and tobacco as big cash crops definitely helped with that. And for those who think the northern states were scot-free in all of this, the money that the manufacturers earned, produced, et cetera, in the North was based on the cheap raw products they could get from the South. So just because slavery wasn't legal in a lot of the northern states by 1860 did not mean that their income was not derived from the practice of slavery. Now, in 1860, in what would become Union states and territories, as we're still slightly before the Civil War, but it's our every 10-year census, so we have stats. There were 451,021 enslaved, predominantly in Delaware, Maryland, DC, the counties which would become West Virginia, which became a state in 1863, Kentucky, and Missouri. Because remember that Missouri Compromise, Missouri got to be a slave state. And having lived in Kansas and studied the Bleeding Kansas period from 1851 to statehood in 1861, those Missourians really wanted Kansas to be a slave state. And most Kansans did not want Kansas to be a slave state. And it was a very bloody 10-year battle that was kind of a prelude to the larger Civil War. So we're going to talk about where to find records of these free people of color. It's a small group in the greater context, but it is a significant group. These records are going to have been created on the local level, but they may currently be held at the local level, at the regional level, at the state level, or at the national level, depending on the record and depending on the state. and depending on where they landed. Sometimes they're in a university archive just because of, they were in family papers. So, the papers that are going to become helpful in this search will be federal census records between 1790 and 1860. 1790 is our first federal census because we did not become independent and figure out our laws and how we were going to do our government and representation and all of that until 1783. And it took a few years and they decided, well, we'll do our first big count on the 0 years. And that has been taken every 10 years on the 0 years, including in 2020. Hopefully everybody here sent in their census form and got counted. But federal census records between 1790 and 1860, because we're not really talking about anything post-Civil War in this presentation. Mortality census schedules for 1850 and 1860 included both enslaved deaths as well as white deaths. And those are only for the calendar year preceding the census being taken. And I don't remember if that's an April 1st census in those years or not, but 1879 or 1849 and 50, 1859 and 60 are the targets there. So it doesn't, if you died other points in those time frames, it doesn't catch it. But if sometimes we love those genealogy moments where you have the person in the right place at the right time to create that record. I can't speak to the 1850 and 1860, but my third great grandfather is on the 1870 mortality schedule. And when I found that, he died of pneumonia. It was just that genealogy happy dance because I knew something about him before the death certificates would have been prevalent in the 20th century. So those are great places to look. Probate court records. As people died, they left plans, fulfilled or unfulfilled, to emancipate or manumit some of their enslaved persons. And those can be wonderful moments of, oh, I have a name, I have a relationship, sometimes I have a why. In South Carolina, you would look in equity court records. In Virginia and other states, it would be chancery court. It's the same function, it's just a different name for the court. And these would be if somebody is protesting a probate decision or needing probate to happen before the youngest of the heirs was 21, to keep things from lingering for 20 years until that 1-year-old infant grows up. So that talks about divisions of property, and equity and chancery court are all written testimony. So sometimes badly written, bad handwriting, but it survives, whereas court testimony that would be somebody transcribing oral testimony might not survive. Magistrate and freeholders court records, particularly in the South, but in other places as well. Freeholders court or something similar that functioned in that realm was where if you had a problem with someone who was a free person of color and you were not, either you were another free person of color or you were not a person of color, then that would go to that particular court for a decision. Neighborly disputes, those types of things. Magistrate's court tends to be those small, it's not exactly our current small claims court, but it's more of that idea. It's local disagreements or issues. There are guardianship records for free persons of color. One of the things in many manumissions you will find manumission being a free, a document freeing a slave, someone who was enslaved, is that there had to be something in the guardianship. You couldn't just be a free person walking around, free person of color walking around in pretty much any state, definitely any of the southern states, without a white person vouching for you. And I've got some examples here in a minute. And by the 1800s, different states had different timelines, but by the early 1800s, there were restrictions on how long you could live as a free person of color in certain places. So you might have 3 months, 6 months, a year before you as a free person of color had to leave the state and move somewhere else, primarily west or north. And obviously you had to leave your family and all of that. I have seen a couple of records here in Spartanburg County where someone is a free person of color who decides to skate along the line of it, and so that they could stay with or near their family. And some were successful and some were like, yeah, you got to get out of here, or you got to sign back up for being, a life indenture. And so sometimes you see that paperwork in the 1800s because somebody doesn't want to move west or wherever. You may find other county records such as conveyance books. So as part of deeds, as part of property transactions, deeds of sale of enslaved are recorded in the deed books for many places. Manumission books, some counties had specific manumission books. Not so much in Spartanburg. We did not have the scale of enslaved that some other places closer to the coast had. So some of the records you see more prevalent and more of them in coastal areas versus here in the upstate. You may also see sheriff's sale books. So if someone went into debt, the court called them in to settle a debt, they couldn't pay the debt, the enslaved were property and might have been sold off to someone to meet the original owner's debt. That someone who bought them may have bought them and freed them. So you don't know until you look at the records what you're going to find. In South Carolina, we do have colonial state records for South Carolina from 1671 to 1865, which do include manumissions, bills of sale, deeds of trust, etc., on the statewide level. So sometimes it wasn't filed locally, it was filed in a state level court. And so the records ended up there. The deeds of trust, and I think there's an example in my pack, but those are interesting because it was a way to get around that free person of color had to leave the state within, name the time period that was the law at the time. It was a deed of trust, which would free the enslaved, but leave them under legal guardianship in a trust. They would be owned by the trust. And so it was maneuvering to get around that law so that they could stay near family, etc. So I was not able to dig far enough down that rabbit hole to know how often that happened, but I thought that was kind of an interesting little legal loophole that people found. There are some state-free Black capitation tax books. I had to practice that one. Primarily for the city of Charleston. So the city of Charleston had a fairly significant free Black population at certain times. And so there was a head tax for the free Blacks. So it was similar to a personal property tax that was, or a voter tax that the white population was paying, but it was called the Free Black Capitation Tax. Capitation meaning head. So the state Department of Archives and History holds those books, I believe, or has copies of them. Military records can be important because many African Americans fought in the Revolutionary War, in the Civil War on both sides, but most often for the Union, in the Indian Wars in the 1840s. They generated records in military records. So that's a good place to look. There's also an 1869 Militia Registration in South Carolina that does list both white and I think they call them colored in that particular record. Terms change over time. Church records are fabulous records, especially as we get into the era post emancipation where African American AME and other church denominations are starting. But even prior to emancipation, African Americans were allowed and in many cases encouraged to become Christian and become saved and join churches. And you will often find lists of those African Americans enslaved or free in those church records. And then plantation records. Plantation records are one of the harder ones to find because they end up in attics and sometimes end up at institutions of higher learning in their archives, states away from where you anticipate them being, because the granddaughter or great-granddaughter or grandson who inherited them happened to go to name the school, and that's where their papers were given, and these older plantation records happen to be at that place. There are some Bethea family records that ended up going south with some records or some descendants who ended up in Mississippi and Alabama that ended up at Duke, I think. In Raleigh, Durham, Chapel Hill, one of those schools, Duke or UNC Chapel Hill. So the plantations in South Carolina are in historic Marion District, South Carolina. I would not be looking in Mississippi or North Carolina for those. Luckily, Bethea is a pretty uncommon name. So if you're a Bethea, white or black, we're related somehow. I mean, it's my second great grandmother who was the Bethea, but still, we're related. We're kin in the larger sense. So you may have to be a little strategic and just, it's the needle in the haystack. But when you find that, and more of that type of record is becoming findable with the internet. If not digitized online, at least finding aids are being published. So I am going to hopefully shift over. Okay, where is my screen sharing? Okay, I need to screen share. I need to stop my screen share. Hi, everybody online. Let me screen share this and let me close that, maybe. People in the room, be patient with me. Okay. Okay. Now, as I step forward, okay. So Cheryl, can you confirm that you can see roll of citizens, please?
I can see the role of citizens, and you're making it larger right now. So is that what you wanted?
Yes. Yes.
Okay.
Technology is almost my friend. It was not my friend earlier when none of these PDFs would go into my presentation. So they're slightly out of order, but we'll take them as we come to them. And I apologize for it being slightly disorganized. I have been on vacation for 11 days. So this is the role of citizens in the militia enrollment for Darlington County, District of Grant or Grant Township. These are the guys between 18 and 30 years of age in 1869. So this one's one of those examples slightly beyond, but it's great to look at. But you will see here that we've got Melton, McGivern, etc. And you get their occupation and you get their color. So the first one on the list is James, and he is colored. And JC is white, and you get down here, and you get Mr. Patterson here is a shoemaker who is colored, afflicted in one leg. So you do get sometimes some information about your person. And you get down here to JJ Rouse, who is a shoemaker. He's 28, and that would be my second great grandfather. So, but this is alphabetized. So it's within the township and it's alphabetized. So you don't necessarily get to see where they were living within that township, but that township's not that large in Darlington County. So it gives you an idea of who is living near each other. And sometimes you get a whole bunch of people with the same name, both colored and white, in this enrollment. And that gives you some real big clues as to Civil War relationships. This is, come on. Really? Really? Okay. Oh, so this is another example on this role of citizens, again in Darlington, but Lunny Township, between 30 and 45 years of age. So that first one was up to 20 or 29 or up to 30, basically. And so you get down here and there is, got to get to the R's. There is Robert A. Rouse, who's 44 and a farmer in Lunny. So if I've got the right Robert A. Rouse, that's JJ's father. So you can look through, and the townships are not that far apart. So, but it is helpful to check those types of things. Oh, gracious, come on. Come on, let me see if I can zoom in on this one, sorry. Nope, I don't want to search with Bing. I want to zoom in, thank you very much. Okay, so this is an 1869 state census, again, at the end of our time period, but 1869 state census. Unfortunately, Spartanburg County does not survive in this. Fragments of Union County do. And we have this on microfilm, and it's available on our various census websites. But this is for Beaufort County, South Carolina. Beaufort is in North Carolina. Beaufort is in South Carolina. I have to think about it every time. And this is an example given by the State Archives in their Guide to African American Research, which is linked on your handout, on tonight's handout. But it tells you head of household, how many males, white and colored, how many females, white and colored, between 6 and 16 years of age, males over the age of 21, and then the total number of persons white and colored. So I guess women, if we were over the age of, as they amended it, 16, then we're just we have to do the math and figure out who's in that number. But it was, a lot of this was for school funding, beginning on some of the early public school initiatives, as well as taxation for the males over 21 years of age, and voting was coming at this point. And now this, I have to give credit to the National Museum of African American History and Culture, which I visited on my vacation last week ago. I was there, and they have a couple of examples of freedom papers on exhibit. I did not ask permission to put it in my program, but it is our national treasure museum, so I hope they're okay with it. But Joseph Trammell was a free African American required to register, and they gave you a copy of the papers. If you lost that copy of the papers, you were at high risk of being re-enslaved because you could not prove you were a free person of color and not a runaway. And so this is an example. The 10 here in the middle of the screen, he made this 10 box to keep his paper safe. And the paper is here at the top of the display. So you might have inherited something like that, or someone in your family may have inherited something like that. These don't always survive through the generations because many of the people in the children and grandchildren generation either wanted to forget, their parent wouldn't talk about their time in slavery, would not talk about it, and so it was not seen as important. Sometimes these papers just through moves and through life happening disappear. But your family may have something like this. So it's worth looking for and asking the question. This is another example, but Belinda, who was an enslaved woman born in Africa, petitioned the Massachusetts legislature in 1783 for her freedom. And she, in her petition, talked about the horrors of slavery and the terror of her kidnapping in Africa through her experience of enslavement. Now, this is before her petition, is prior to that transatlantic slave trade ending in 1807. So they, in Africa, they would go in, they would kidnap people. They would buy people from the losing side, from the winners of an internal war and from the losing side, and load them on ships and take them off to sell. But this is one of those clerks that you always wish you got that clerk. The handwriting is very nice. But she petitioned the Massachusetts legislature for her freedom and gained her freedom in 1783. So before Massachusetts really got all of their emancipation stuff and Even when they did, it was that gradual emancipation. This is an example of someone gaining their freedom prior to that being the norm. And I'm not sure I'd have the guts to petition the legislature for something. Am I that important? But yes, each individual is that important. So anyway, there are published accounts. This happens, Rockingham County, Virginia is the county I grew up in Virginia. And Dorothy Boyd Rush took the time to transcribe the Register of Free Blacks of Rockingham County from 1807 to 1859. And if it's saved correctly, yes. So we have some examples here. Isaac there in the middle of page was petition number 120, or not petition, registration number 126 on page 52 of the Rockingham County book. The clerk says, registered in my office is number 126, 1st of April, 1828. Isaac, a dark mulatto, about 5 feet 9 inches high, about 28 years of age, a scar on the back of the right hand and a small one just at the large wrist bone of the left arm. The little finger is implied. On the left hand is stiff, was set free by the will of David Laird, deceased, recorded in my office. The foregoing register was examined and compared with the said Isaac and found duly made a copy is ordered to be delivered him, done at April Court in 1828. And then in the margin, they confirm that the copy was delivered to Isaac on the 10th of October, 1828. So we have the copy in the court record with a physical description in it, as well as a copy that he had. So there was backup for that individual copy, but you couldn't necessarily get back to that copy. And did they know you in that town? Sometimes they would have, sometimes the court officers might not have known you. I found this one, these two on this page are both for women, which gives some insight into surnames. Or sorry, Pichu is a male, but Eliza Swingler, formerly Bundy. So, Eliza Swingler registered in August of 1843. She was formerly Eliza Bundy, 5 foot high, a black or dark mulatto, about 24 years of age. Again, it lists the scars. And so, but it gives us two surnames, either married surname or surname of former owner and the surname she chose. We don't know which until we start researching them, but it gives us more clues to go on. We have that physical example. And okay, this is an example of a deed of gift from the South Carolina Department of Archives and History. And an indenture is another name for it. An indenture is an agreement. It can be a land agreement. It can be an employment agreement. It can be, in this case, an emancipation agreement. And so it talks about, it's in Pendleton County, and Bannister Harper, in confirmation of the natural love and affection which he hath and bearing to him his beloved son William Harper. Also, you know, he's giving money away, and then later on, it mentions some of the enslaved that to be provided for and free. So, and it's the deed of gift between a father and a son, but there are provisions in that. So, and again, not horrible clerk handwriting, which is a nice treat. This a little less fun handwriting, but it is trial papers in magistrate, I think magistrate's court, magistrate and freeholder court in Anderson district. And so again, this is an example from the State Archives of South Carolina, but it talks about this case that February 1843, Marianne, a female slave, the property of Dr. Broyles, knowing the slave Simon to be a runaway, didn't, it's, hey, you didn't report a runaway, you're getting hauled in, you harbored the runaway. And so this is the court information. And again, these are just types of records you may be able to find. And this one, I got to get to the citation of this list. And of course, the controls are over where the citation is. I apologize. But this is a list of inventories. So estate inventories where enslaved persons have been listed by name. And so again, you may find people being freed here. You may just find enslaved ancestors, but it's a good thing to think about looking for. And it gives ages, it gives valuations of what they and their labor were worth. This is a state-free capitation tax book. This is that Charleston record that I mentioned earlier. And so it tells us that John Burke was a carpenter and lived on Wall Street, that Phyllis Barron lived on Wentworth Street, that Malcolm Brown was a shoemaker, lived at 45 Anson Street. So this capitation tax list tells us who and their address. And so if you are fortunate enough that whoever you're looking for lives in one of the places that might have this type of tax list, like Charleston, it's definitely worth looking for. This is a bill of sale in 1807. Again, these are from the South Carolina Department of Archives and History, and their online guide. But some earlier bills of sale don't have the printed, and like Spartanburg for that era does not have the printed. It's just all handwritten. But when they're doing a lot more of a certain type of record, they have forms that they fill in the information for. Saves the clerk's hand a little bit. Charleston also had a little more money than some of the other courts did. So, and you get the recording of it there. And this is Andrew Lachey's probably, an African boy of about 10 years of age of the Congo nation. And I am having trouble reading this handwriting. And so So Andrew Lachey is purchasing the African boy. So, but that's what a bill of sale looks like. This one is a manumission. So the statement of freeing. So, got there. And sometimes you have lovely margin writing. So, to be copied for Polly. So it is to be copied for Polly, who is being freed. But they fully and absolutely manumit, enfranchise, set free, and discharge my mulatto woman slave named Hester and her two mulatto children named Mary and William, before now commonly called and known by the names of Polly and Billy. So Mary is known as Polly. Polly is getting a copy of this as well. So we don't know what age that child is, but we now know her mother was Hester, and her brother was William. So it gives some valuable genealogical information in this manumission. And then there are more manumissions of various slaves by this person in the same document. And this is in Charleston, and I do not see, the previous one was in 1791. So sometime after January of 1791 is when that next one appeared. So, okay. This is tax returns in Fairfield County, and I am looking for a date and I do not see the date. And it could just be that I'm not looking in the right place. But this gives values of capitation tax on males between 21 and 60, value of land. And this is, it's talking about the Freedmen's Bureau. So this is in the 1860s up to about 1872 when the Freedmen's Bureau was active. So, and I need to move faster. Again, a different page of the tax return. This is the voter registration for Beaufort County in 1868 that I mentioned earlier. And you will see that in Beaufort County, in the Beaufort electoral precinct, there are, in the S's page, continuation probably from the previous page, 5 whites with surnames starting with S, and then you see the list of colored men whose names start with S. So that 1868 voter registration is pretty critical. And it is one of those things where that has now been indexed and digitized online. So some of our staff here helped with some of the indexing of that for Spartanburg and Union counties. They asked us to do Cherokee County, and they were forgetting that Cherokee County did not exist until 1897. So this again is an example of that 1868 militia or 1869 militia enrollment. from Georgetown. And this is a clerk's pay voucher for, I believe in the Revolutionary War. Commissioner of the Navy, 1778. As you can tell, it has had a little bit of a hard life itself as a document, but it is pay. If you see here in the middle, 28, line 28 is Jack, a Negro. He was a pilot in the Navy, and he's getting his pay. So it is verification that he served in the Navy in the Revolution. This is an example of the mortality schedule for 1860, Prince William Parish in Beaufort District, South Carolina. But you see the cause of death here. You see the profession or trade. You see the place of birth. You see the number of days ill, fever, dropsy, pneumonia, diphtheria, fever, consumption. Sarah died of old age. But you see free or slave, the first four are slaves, and black, but then you see others are white, and you see some are married, widowed, etc. So again, it's an interesting snapshot into those specific time frames and what people were dying of at that time. And this is Freedmen's Bureau. Again, this is slightly out of our time period, but this is a marriage record from the 1867, 8, 9 through about 1872. And it lists the marriages of the registered with the Freedmen's Bureau, because of course enslaved people were not allowed to be married officially, legally. Didn't stop them from proclaiming that they were married, living as man and wife. So this is a guardianship. We do also have a book of guardianships here in the Kennedy room that we have had copied from the loose papers at the state archives. And we're working on improving our indexing of these records. But it's literally photocopies of loose little scraps of paper. So it is what survived in the records that made it in the box to the archives for Spartanburg County. We have copies of that so that people can come look at those. They are fun, but sometimes heartbreaking to read. All of these documents tend to be, it's not the easiest of records to grapple with. But this is an example from Greenville County, again from the state website, state archives. This is an equity bill from Richland County. And again, it's the list and valuation of the Negroes of the estate of Robert Adams, deceased, and it was the commissioners appointed by the court to make the partition of the estate. So, okay. On your handout, on the back of the handout, there are some websites given as resources. I did not get all the books listed, but a lot of the books are on the second handout, the Researching Your African American Ancestor handout. That has a lot of the books. It has some of these same websites as well. But a couple of the websites I do want to highlight real quick. For South Carolina and the border states, There are a couple really great resources. The Afrogenius and Low Country Africana sites focus in on South Carolina and our kind of bubble around us. I think Afrogenius may go do South Carolina, Georgia, Florida. One of them does. The Free African Americans of Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, Maryland, and Delaware. Paul Heinig, who runs that website, we have a bunch of his published books, which may be easier to navigate than the website. But the website's there and searchable, and knowing that we would have hybrid people in the room with me and people online from all over the country, I'm trying to make sure I give resources that anybody can get to. And those books may be in other libraries beside ours. The National Museum of African American History and Culture in DC, part of the Smithsonian, they do have a research area and a library area. If you go to their website and you click the Learn tab, you can get to some of this information. They do have a genealogist on staff who wasn't there the day I was there because I was there on a Sunday, but they have some resources as well. In Charleston, we are really fortunate that the International African American Museum is opening later this year. God willing, and the creek don't rise. And Tony Carrier has been heading up that genealogy research center, and she's already been doing some work online with that, even without the physical space being open yet. But that's an exciting collection for us to have available to us in South Carolina. We're hoping to get her up here at some point to speak. Also, the Digital Library on American Slavery, that is a site out of UNC Greensboro, and that is a site where individuals can contribute items that they come across. There are a number of sites similar to this. This is just the one I know the best, where if you find a will, if you find a manumission paper, if you find, you can contribute digital copies to that so that it is more readily available to more people. And they have students working on projects and that kind of thing, where they are crowdfunding a lot of things with that. And then Daughters of the American Revolution, Forgotten Patriots. I've linked the specific page on the dar.org website. If you find that you're looking for someone who may have served in the revolution, and there were quite a few free people of color or people who earned their freedom by fighting in revolution, etc. DAR is really working to recognize those previously forgotten patriots, African American, Native American, women, etc. So they've got more and more resources in that section, and we've got a book that they have published on forgotten patriots in the room. So just some great places. South Carolina Department of Archives and History has a resource booklet for African American genealogy that has more than just the pre-1865, which is what we concentrated on tonight. And it will help you target some of these resources, gives you more information about some of the resources that we talked about tonight. Christine's African American Genealogy website is another of those that like Low Country Africana and Afrogenius really works in this region, although Christine's has a little broader scope. So there are some great resources out there. I hope what we've talked about gives you some ideas of places to look and what to be looking for when you go to those documents. And I will open it up for questions. And I see we have some chat. So okay, let's try this again. Okay. The people in the room with me can see the chat now. I think if I don't.
I sent them to your Kennedy Room account.
Yeah.
The 2 questions.
Okay.
You see them? They're from Charles Wilson.
Yes. You mentioned a concentrated number of free persons of color in Charleston. Are there current maps that would show where free persons of color were concentrated in the South prior to the Civil War? So I'm trying to think where maps would be. And the 1868 voter registration, it might include some males under 21, but only if they were faking their age. It was really that you had to be 21 and of voting age to do it. Now, I have seen many people on the bubble on military registrations that fudged their age a year or two. So possibly, let me see if the free persons of color, and we've got the screen sharing going, correct? Now, can I remember the website? Maybe that'll get it to us. There is a project out of the University of Richmond that this American Panorama is part of. It's a historical atlas of the United States. This is, there's some land acquisition and dispossession. Okay, mapping inequality, redlining. But I think there is, yes, well, this is forced migration. So forced migration of enslaved people between 1810 and 1860. And you can go through some of these maps and see, but this is an example of one of the maps they put together, like the UNCG digital library of slavery. This is a mapping data project at University of Richmond. And so in the 1810s, let me see if it's a click, yes. In the 1820s, you see that Western movement of enslaved. In the 1830s, that were moved south and west across that Trans-Mississippi South. 1840s, you're getting into Texas. And then 1850s, it really was going south and west by the 1850s. Specifically to across the South in that granular thing, I would have to dig a little bit further, but this is a very likely place. Edward Ayers, A-Y-E-R-S, former or President Emeritus of University of Richmond, Professor Emeritus at University of Virginia in history. He was instrumental in starting this and has published a bunch of really solid books and research things. We have a physical copy of some of these maps in a book in the room. And so, with the migration of people, Black and white, moving, and it does talk about the 20th century, the Great Migration north of African Americans. So in these maps, in these projects, it's highly likely that that information exists. I just haven't had a chance to go that specifically into that. It may show by county. I'm sorry, reading the question. It may show by counties. There is also, I can't remember where I have seen one of the maps that does go county by county on this topic, but there's probably one out there, but I'm not sure where you would Google it to find out. I happen to know about the Edward Ayers, Dr. Ayers projects. So that would be a starting point, and you may find some references out. I would also check at state archives, because sometimes they have those resources where there's mapping. So, are there other questions? Awesome. Well, thank you everybody online and in the room for joining me tonight. I am around in the Kennedy room at the Spartanburg County Public Libraries, and you are welcome to contact us. Our general email is kroom@infodepot.org. KROOM, Kennedy room. Our old website before we became Spartanburg Libraries was Infodepot, INFODEPOT, because we were the information depot for the hub city of Spartanburg. And it's a great play on words for trains and information, and it was hard to communicate to people, and they changed our website to Spartanburg Libraries, but we haven't gotten everything changed over yet. So it is what it is. But thank you so much for joining us, and we'll see you next month. And as I said, I've been on vacation. What is next month's program? Next month's program is Newsbank, our new Newsbank, new to us Newsbank databases, which are newspaper databases for historic Herald Journal, Herald and Journal, and the Herald Journal between 1906 and 1998, and the current one between 1988 to current, as well as Heritage Hub, which is an obituary database program. And if we have time, we'll take a look at the state libraries databases also from Newsbank that include the historic Charleston News and Courier, as well as the state newspaper out of Columbia, because newspaper research can be a wonderful boon for your research, especially 20th century. So thank you so much. Yeah, Cheryl was backing me up on the Newsbank. And then April, we'll be talking about naming conventions. So thanks so much. See you soon. Okay, let's stop sharing there. Good to see everybody. And